Hey guys! Welcome to AWS DBA. In this session, we are going to see about evaluating performance metrics. Evaluating performance metrics. A DB instance has a number of different categories of metrics, and how to determine acceptable values depends on the metric. CPU. CPU utilization, percentage of computer processing capacity used. Memory. Freeable memory, how much RAM is available on the DB instance, in megabytes. The red line in the monitoring tab metrics is marked at 75% for CPU, memory and storage metrics. If instance memory consumption frequently crosses that line, then this indicates that you should check your workload or upgrade your instance. Swap usage, how much swap space is used by the DB instance, in megabytes. Disk space. Free storage space, how much disk space is not currently being used by the DB instance, in megabytes. Input/output operations. Read IOPS, write IOPS, the average number of disk read or write operations per second. Read throughput, write throughput, the average number of megabytes read from or written to disk per second. Queue depth, the number of I/O operations that are waiting to be written to or read from disk. Network traffic. Network receive throughput, network transmit throughput, the rate of network traffic to and from the DB instance in megabytes per second. Database connections. DB connections, the number of client sessions that are connected to the DB instance. Generally speaking, acceptable values for performance metrics depend on what your baseline looks like and what your application is doing. Investigate consistent or trending variances from your baseline. Advice about specific types of metrics follows. High CPU or RAM consumption. High values for CPU or RAM consumption might be appropriate, provided that they are in keeping with your goals for your application, like throughput or concurrency, and are expected. Disk space consumption. Investigate disk space consumption if space used is consistently at or above 85% of the total disk space. See if it is possible to delete data from the instance or archive data to a different system to free up space. Network traffic. For network traffic, talk with your system administrator to understand what expected throughput is for your domain network and internet connection. Investigate network traffic if throughput is consistently lower than expected. Database connections. Consider constraining database connections if you see high numbers of user connections in conjunction with decreases in instance performance and response time. The best number of user connections for your DB instance will vary based on your instance class and the complexity of the operations being performed. You can determine the number of database connections by associating your DB instance with a parameter group where the user connections parameter is set to other than 0, unlimited. You can either use an existing parameter group or create a new one. IOPS metrics. The expected values for IOPS metrics depend on disk specification and server configuration, so use your baseline to know what is typical. Investigate if values are consistently different than your baseline. For best IOPS performance, make sure your typical working set will fit into memory to minimize read and write operations. For issues with any performance metrics, one of the first things you can do to improve performance is tune the most used and most expensive queries to see if that lowers the pressure on system resources. If your queries are tuned and an issue persists, consider upgrading your Amazon RDS DB instance classes to one with more of the resource, CPU, RAM, disk space, network bandwidth, I/O capacity, that is, related to the issue you are experiencing.